This week's episode of Covert Contact is brought to you by Klaatu. Now, I have no idea who that is. It's an anonymous patron, but I appreciate your support. If you would like to get involved, if you would like to support this show, go to patreon.com/covertcontact or go to blogsofwar.com. You'll find all the information that you need to get involved and to support the show there. Thank you.
I'm Fred Burton, former State Department Special Agent and author of Under Fire. Protecting the British royals was always a very unique experience for those of us assigned to protect them when they visited the United States, especially Princess Diana. Although we had many problems with her visits, mostly centered around paparazzi and the mentally disturbed threat. In the back of our minds was always terrorism, especially with the assassination of Lord Mountbatten in the past, as well as the IRA efforts to try to kill the Queen. When Princess Diana died in the car crash in France, I was always puzzled as to why the French had not provided protection to her, just based upon my knowledge of the problems that had surrounded her visits to the United States.
Welcome to Covert Contact from Blogs of War, where each week your host John Little takes a deep dive into the national security, intelligence, and technology stories that are shaping our world.
Welcome to Covert Contact, episode 85. I am your host, John Little. Joining me today is Levi West. He's the Director of Terrorism Studies at Charles Sturt University in Canberra. And he was here for episode 77, so he's a returning guest. I think we mentioned during that episode that we wanted to talk about terrorism and terrorist use of technology, and that is what we're going to do today. Levi, welcome back to Covert Contact.
It's a pleasure to be back.
This is your specialty. You've focused much of your work on examining how terrorist organizations broadly use technology, right?
Yeah. So it's a particular area of research that I try and understand.
Maybe the biggest story in this space in the past few years has been ISIS and their use of social media. Got a lot of attention. Was, I've done several episodes and pieces on this. In some ways, very effective, and in other ways, sort of overrated. Am I making sense? I mean, I know that seems contradictory, but
yeah, I think the thing that's important to sort of keep in mind about the Islamic State, or whatever we call them this week, and the exploitation of social media, if we call it that, is that there's three really important things to understand about it. One is that it's multifaceted, right? That what we all know and hear about extensively is the Western-orientated and predominantly English language social media content that they generate.
Right.
The other important thing to keep in mind with the Islamic State's use of social media, and I think we can sort of fold the platforms into that a little bit, but we'll talk about it a bit later, is that much of the analysis of it is ahistorical. So it treats it as a uniquely novel event that's unprecedented. And in the sense that they are specifically using social media to share video content and share English language jihadist magazines, it is unprecedented. But the fundamentals of what they're doing is pretty much sort of nuts and bolts terrorism 101. And so we tend to look at this as if it's historically unique, and it's really not. It's in terms of its fundamentals, pretty similar to the way that anarchist terrorists in the late 1800s and early 1900s in Russia and Europe, and then eventually in the United States, exploited the invention and industrialization of the rotary printing press, and the way that they exploited the invention of dynamite. It's pretty similar to the way that numerous terrorists in the 70s, 60s and 70s and into the 80s exploited the frequency with which people suddenly found themselves flying on commercial airliner jets and hijacked them and started designing terrorist operations to suit television coverage. It's about engaging as a terrorist organisation, thinking about the information and communications technology environment that you're working in and the technologies of violence that you have available to you. And that much of what we think about ISIS's, activities and the mechanisms that they use, it's novel and unique in a number of fronts in the things that it enables them to achieve, but at the same time, it looks a lot like things that have happened many times before. And the last thing about it is that for our purposes, what it's tended to facilitate, excluding a couple of instances, is relatively low-level, low-body count terrorist operations. It's the way that ISIS has used it for external operations in the Western world has been to get one guy to encourage one guy to run a vehicle into a crowd of people. And whilst that is a tragic event for the people that die in the attack, it's not 3,000 people in the Twin Towers coming down.
Yeah, so it's certainly not an existential threat for a state.
And then in analysing it and looking at how significant it is in terms of their overall organisation, their overall activities, right, is that if we look at the English language social media output and the consequences of that, and compare it to the consequences of what they managed to achieve in Syria and Iraq, and the people that have died in Raqqa and Mosul as a result of their capacity to overrun and then have lost those areas and the territories in between, one of those things is much more significant and consequential than the other. For us, as English language Westerners, the English language and Western orientated stuff looks like it's the most important thing. But I think a sort of a much colder analysis of Islamic State's overall activities demonstrates that, actually it's interesting and important, but it's not the most consequential thing that Islamic State have done. So, I think it's an area that I find it fascinating. But
I think it's interesting that we can discuss it now, because in a relatively short time frame, they went from this explosive presence on Twitter to essentially, they're not completely silenced, but their impact is. We've really managed to find a way to address that. It's a fraction of what it was, at the start of their rise.
Yeah, I think there's some important things about that. One is that in the open source, yes, right, and by open source I don't mean in the classification sense. I mean in the terms of open platforms.
Right.
So on Twitter, they're not there really, right, and certainly not in terms of distributing from central housing or from official wilayat offices of their media operations. The fan base is still there, right?
Right.
And so there is still a community of people on Twitter who sympathise with the cause for which Islamic State, believes that it's acting. But for the most part, anything official that's being put out is going straight to Telegram, and that's a shift from running both platforms. Yeah. So for a while, everything was being put out still on Twitter and on Telegram as well. But now we're looking almost exclusively at Telegram. And that's for some self-evident reasons. But the other half of that equation too is that the centralised media operations that were headquartered out of wherever they were in Syria or Iraq isn't there anymore. So there's some baseline kinetic reasons for why their output, for why Ramaya magazine hasn't showed up. I don't think that's because the guy who was responsible for making the decisions about when the next Ramaya magazine should come up has taken a sickie, taken a day off. It's because the capability has been hit fairly substantially in strictly kinetic terms. So, there's this sort of variety of reasons for why it's not what it was. And,
where do you fall on the question of platforms aggressively attacking these accounts? Do you see benefit in letting them sort of untouched and gathering intelligence from them, or do you think there is value in shutting them down?
Yeah, I find myself in a rolling state of being torn in regards to this. I have some principled positions that in the abstract sound really great, which is that I don't like the idea of the state, let alone the private sector, deciding what it is that I can and can't view. Now, censorship is one thing, but on political issues and religious issues, my default position is like, look, I'm not really okay with that. If it doesn't breach the terms of service, then it shouldn't be removed. That gets grossly complicated when I look at al-Awlaki videos, right, that I know play an enormous role in helping admittedly, a very small slice of people get to the point where they think it's acceptable and justifiable to go off and do whatever. There's a part of me who still thinks that until someone starts openly advocating violence, in the abstract, that video ought to stay there. That gets problematic when I know that as a result, or at least that those videos contribute to people deciding that they think it's okay to kill people. So I find myself torn. I find it endlessly fascinating that the broader public is entirely reasonably comfortable with the idea of the private sector doing this. Yet if the state was to engage in these activities, I think the public would be far more uncomfortable, and I find that an amazing state of affairs. The other thing I think about takedowns or whatever we want to call it is that it depends which agency you're coming from in terms of your perspective, or which sort of domain of government you think about. So from a law enforcement perspective, a strict conventional law enforcement perspective, there are successes in that, right? We can take it down and we can preserve it, and we can use it for evidence later on to prosecute someone who's committed an offence, and that's great, and that's an entirely legitimate perspective. The other half of that equation, though, is an intel equation, right? Which is that actually, if we could just leave that there, that'd be really good, because we're building a picture of what's going on. And my tendency is to lean towards the latter, which is that there's an awful lot of value in having that kind of content up, and having it up on relatively open and relatively accessible platforms. I also think in a slightly more sense, almost glib, right, is that I think particularly for a younger cohort, which is what we're looking at in the West, you're adding a layer of, you're adding a lure to the content if you're making it harder to access. Because you're not making it go away by not having it on YouTube, right? It's not on YouTube anymore, but that doesn't mean that video is not on the internet.
It's something more attractive now. It's driven underground, and therefore it's a little sexier.
Yeah. I think so. I mean, I don't think that's a determining factor in whether or not kid number 3 accesses an Al-Awlaki video or not. So, like I said, I wind up torn between a whole range of legitimate positions on it, and I think the thing that probably makes me fall, or probably the thing that concerns me the most about it, is the use of AI. Okay, I'm kind of okay with the idea if it was me sitting in front of a computer with some, subject matter expertise, and frankly, I wouldn't do it on my own. I'd want a guy who knows his way around the theology really well, and a guy who knows his way around the symbols of jihadism really well, so that we could sit down, watch the video, and assess just how dangerous that video is in a CT context. I don't like the idea that there's a point in time where, since it's being done by tech companies, where that decision-making process is outsourced to the equivalent of a call center. And does the video meet the checklist parameters? Yes, tick, 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 tick. And I think everyone who's followed this debate so far, would be familiar with the concerns that are being raised about the removal of video footage from stuff out of Syria. Footage of human rights abuses, footages of all types of things that could be potentially used in the future to prosecute people for things that have happened in Syria, that are being removed because the tools are relatively blunt. And so I think there's a dilemma around that winds up making me kind of lean towards that. Look, a video on its own doesn't make someone become a terrorist. That's where I sort of wind up sitting, is that, look, it is important and it plays a role, and we can look at the litany of cases, and you look at like the guy in San Bernardino who sat with his neighbour in the garage, learning jihad from Anwar al-Awlaki. But it's a kind of almost linear way of understanding the process by which someone gets to the point where they commit violence, and that. I don't know. I really don't. I think it's such an enormously complex space where there's some really important values of Western liberal democracy on the one hand, around freedom of speech and freedom of belief and being free to think what you want about the world. If that's what you want to believe about the world, Western liberal democracy, that's supposed to be okay until you decide that violent jihad is the solution to the problem. That's supposed to be kind of okay. And I get a bit nervous about those kind of moves to censor and filter.
I think where I come down on it is It's sort of as confused as your position. I think, I believe that governments should have they should lead the way in terms of deciding whether these sort of takedowns make sense or not, and whether there is intelligence value there. And I would like to see much tighter partnerships between governments and platforms. The third sort of leg of this is, these well-meaning, vigilantes that try to get accounts taken down and all of that stuff. They don't, they don't know how to deconflict or anything, right? It potentially does way too much damage.
Yeah, and so I know that there's some people in the last couple of weeks who've been sort of dripping a little bit of information out about concerns that they have with some of the takedown stuff that's happened, the big rush of takedowns that's happened in the last sort of 3 weeks or so from YouTube and other platforms,
right?
Suggesting that there is actually some very substantial consequences that have come about as a result of some of those actions. So, and I think the other one for me too, and this is a problem with CT more generally, is the overwhelming focus on jihadism is justified on a number of fronts. But in the information domain, right, I don't see a great rush by YouTube to take down videos by, the litany of people's names who I now know coming out of the United States, for instance, ranting and raving about what's essentially white supremacy, right? There's plenty of that content on YouTube too, right?
And don't even get me started, because they won't. I just started uploading Covert Contact to YouTube, and they won't let me collect ad revenue because they say it is offensive content. Which,
oh no, yeah.
I mean, there's never been a moment of offensive content in Covert Contact, and I know that I know I'm hitting all their keywords, and that's why it's the algorithm is flagging it. It's not a person. But at the same time, these, like you said, these Nazis are able to stand up perfectly functional and profit producing channels. How is that possible?
Yeah. And I mean, that to me is the key part, right? Nazis.
Yeah.
Like I'm almost past the point of being able to laugh about it. It's not funny anymore. Like it for a while, I was like, oh my God, this is so insanely beyond anything that I can possibly register, and then all I can do is just kind of shake my head and chuckle and kind of go, wow, this is just...
we are legit talking about Nazis in 2017.
Yeah, in America, mind you. I can't. It doesn't... And the fact that the political discourse around extremism and radicalization and terrorism is so dominated by, look, don't get me wrong, an absolutely legitimate focus on the guys who are the most effective at terrorism in the 21st century, hands down, jihad as terrorist organisations. They own the space. But that ought not to preclude us from being capable of walking and chewing gum at the same time, right? We should be able to look at both of these threat dynamics at the same time. So
there are massive media operations, and a lot of them originate out of Europe for these white nationalist movements and things like that. They run really really sophisticated video channels, online videos, and essentially television networks and everything else. So this is essentially the same topic, right? I mean,
I think the hard thing with the right-wing stuff, and I have a degree of sympathy is definitely not the right word. Some understanding as to why it's not focused on the same way. And I think that's about the distinction between extremists and terrorists.
Yeah,
right?
Correct.
So admittedly, there is a line of argument that comes from sort of the sort of, I hate to call it the left, but from sort of left-wing commentators that argues that, look, there was an article a while ago about more people die in the United States from right-wing terrorism than they do from jihadism. And there's two problems with that. One is that it assumes that the body count as a result of terrorism is some kind of meaningful way of measuring its effect, which is not. But the thing it does too is it kind of collapses those two terms, extremism and terrorist, as if they're the same thing. Right? Is that someone who holds beliefs, whether they're the beliefs of Ammar al-Awlaki or Adolf Hitler, is the same thing as a terrorist, and they're not. Right? A terrorist is someone who actually does stuff, who blows stuff up or shoots people or kills people. There's a whole bunch of material support charges that they can be done on about facilitating and providing support and stuff like that. But to my mind, there's excuse me, a really quite substantial distinction between the guys who subscribe, promote, articulate the ideology that sits underneath it, and people who actually do stuff. And the reality about the right wing in the US, don't get me wrong, I've landed in New York when Charlottesville happened earlier this year, and that protest, or whatever we call that, is to my mind offensive and outrageous and unbelievable. But there was one guy there who we can comfortably refer to as a terrorist, and that's the guy who drove the car. The rest of them are ideological fellow travellers, or whatever we want to call them.
Let me push back on that just a little bit. I generally agree with you, but I listen, to the information coming out of both of these camps on a pretty regular basis. I'm sure you do too. In a lot of cases, when you look at sort of white nationalists and those and extremists in that sort of vein, their messaging is very much tuned to appeal to that lone wolf person, that individual actor. It's we are under threat. Somebody has to act. Our opponents are pedophiles and Satanists, and they dehumanize people, and they create a sense of urgency, and they talk about violence. And yes, they haven't acted, but they know exactly what they're doing.
Oh, I agree entirely, and I think the line from Louis Beam's Leaderless Resistance essay is "True patriots will know when to act."
Right.
The thing that that Inspire and Ramaya promotes and facilitates around lone wolves was written in 1992, I think, by Louis Beam, a white supremacist and former KKK member, and promoted throughout the right wing movement well before the jihadis came up with it by themselves. But I think one of the other reasons I think why it doesn't get paid as much attention is the numbers aren't there and the consequences aren't the same. So if we think about Al-Qaeda and Islamic State and we look at the consequences of their actions over the last just the last 16 years, right? So whether we want to talk about the most recent incarnation in Syria and Iraq, or Iraq in 2003, or Afghanistan in 2001, all of the other bits and pieces that have happened, all the domestic stuff that we've done and the Western world's done, all the UN resolutions that have obliged all the member states to do things, etc., etc., etc. I think even in their wildest dreams, most white supremacist or nationalist or skinhead or Nazi movements in Europe and the United States could only dream of those kinds of consequences and the kinds of numbers of people joining their organisations prepared to fight and die. It's a different calculus, I think, for right-wing stuff. At the same time, they're almost a more insidious adversary, if we put it that way, because what they are is, if you permit me to use some political science proper, if we think of the political spectrum of running from left to right, we can think of right-wing inspired terrorism and extremism as an extension of a set of politics that we understand and know, right? So Nazism sits way out to the right of the conservative side of politics, right? And I'm not suggesting for a second that the conservative side of politics permits or tolerates or agrees or anything like that,
right?
But it's an extension of those politics. And the same on the left, right? Antifa and further out to the left again to the Earth Liberation Front, Animal Liberation Front. We can understand their politics. Jihadism is an other. Right? We can't reconcile and understand how it is that we can in analytical circles, but for the broader public, they don't understand it. And that means that the right-wing stuff and the left-wing stuff to a lesser extent.
Would you say that it's legitimate to say that in the West it's the other?
Yes. I think we can
from
flip
our
that
perspective.
around and make, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think we can flip that around and make the same point about the non-Western world.
Correct.
Right? Is that if I'm a middle-of-the-road Indonesian, I can see and understand how someone moves their way further and further up the political spectrum and gets to violent jihadism.
Yes.
In the same way that I can understand how someone goes from being centre-right to deeply conservative to being really hardline libertarian out into sovereign citizen, anti-government, and then maybe out into full-tilt white supremacist Nazi stuff.
Right.
I can get my head around that as a relatively linear extension of politics that I can understand. And I think that's why it isn't condemned universally the way that jihadism is. I think it's why it's not treated the same way, why it's not dedicated the same reason. Part of the reason why it doesn't get the same resource allocation is because we don't see it as a threat the same way that we do as something that we see as another. Right? It's not challenging fundamental values. It doesn't make us feel civilizational. All those types of things, I think, is an important part of the dynamic around right-wing extremism.
Yeah, you move far along the plane, either left or right, and you end up in violence. Right, the body count goes up as you move out.
That's right, and I mean, I think I can remember from long ago in my undergrad, we got taught the political spectrum both as a left to right line linear spectrum,
right,
but also as a circle. Right?
Yep, exactly.
But actually, they start to come back around, and everyone winds up at fascist at some point, right, if you go far enough. Whether you go from the left or the right, you end up insisting that everyone lives the way that you do, and that if you don't, we will kill you. That's the baseline at either end of that spectrum. So, I think it's a space that, and for the same reasons that I mentioned before about why I'm slightly uncomfortable about the takedown stuff, is that if you start trying, imagine we start trying to do that to right-wing extremist content on the internet, right? And where exactly do we start to draw the lines around what it is and isn't okay to advocate and to argue for, if what we're talking about is, the types of issues that get debated by right-wing supremacists, who I'm avoiding mentioning by name, in the United States, right? Like where do we start to cull those? And so then I think it's useful sometimes to get outside of the jihadist context and start to apply the same measures to other types of content, and go, oh wow, that's actually going to be a really, really, really complex and difficult state of affairs.
This is probably a good place to pivot to like a quick wrap up with encryption as well, because one of the things that we have sort of things happening in parallel here. One is these types of folks are increasingly being pushed off of mainstream public platforms, and you have the rise of dead simple encryption and encrypted platforms, and obviously you have things like the ISIS crowd moving into Telegram. How big of a threat do you think encryption and consumer level encryption poses as these groups start leveraging those platforms?
Yeah, I think it presents a really quite substantial challenge for law enforcement and security agencies. But I think, again, much like the ISIS and Twitter equation, I think it's useful to sort of moderate that and to contextualize it a little bit. So what we've seen happen with the Islamic State is that they are largely now, at least in terms of what we can see, distributing most of their content via Telegram only. So there's not much official content being distributed on Twitter. And that's good in the sense that it makes it harder to access that content. And if we're talking about, 16, 18, 21-year-old guys with, seemingly conventional criminal backgrounds, like the guys that did, say, Boston, right? Who, if you can put some relatively rudimentary barriers up between them and the kind of content they're trying to access, then, you're making it harder, if nothing else. And that's a good thing, right? Is that they've got to work out how to use Telegram, even though it's consumer, it's not as simple as Twitter. So, there's some upsides in that sense. The downside is that it's harder to keep track of what's going on. It's harder to know what's going on. It's easier if they're on a relatively popular platform like Telegram or some of the other ones. But if they start to have, genuine technical capabilities that lets them get into spaces that are genuinely difficult to access, then instead of being able to sort of have a pretty reasonable handle on what's going on, we tend to have far less of an idea, or we have to dedicate vastly more resources to knowing what's going on and being able to hold up a picture of what's going on. So I think there's costs and benefits.
So we were talking earlier about cryptocurrency, and there's an obvious benefit, potential benefit for them to use that, in the sense that it's not completely anonymous. That's a little bit too simplistic, but there are ways that you can achieve anonymity, and it is also a lot. It facilitates frictionless cross-border movement of currency. But having said that, it's a little bit challenging to completely understand that space, and probably way beyond your average terrorist in the field. You were talking about the fact that old school criminality, things like smuggling networks and drug sales and dealing in cash. We talk about, all these different types of technologies that are available to them. At the end of the day, it's kind of hard to beat human networks and good old fashioned smuggling.
Yep, for a couple of reasons, right? So one is the return on investment. So, if for a fledgling terrorist organization just establishing itself, then the start point for how we're going to make money is narcotics. Are we based in a region that naturally lends itself to producing the precursor ingredients to one of the big substances that people consume on large scales all over the world?
Yeah,
and are happy to pay. That's right, or Colombia, right?
Yeah.
And if that's the case, then boom, you're in business, right? Your demand is consistent. The price you can manipulate as you choose by turning off and turning on supply. You can use the same networks that you're going to use to smuggle people or weapons or all sorts of other things to smuggle your products out of the country that you're in. You can insert yourself at various points in the production and supply chain. And the money that's generated is phenomenal. And all you've got to do is preserve some type of conflict zone, and you'll be able to continue to produce. And it's relatively straightforward. And then you work down a list of goods to smuggle, and you're going through how terrorist organizations tend to generate their income. The big upside, though, is that if I'm selling, whether it's straight from poppy or whether it's manufactured and turned into Afghan heroin out of Afghanistan, then I'm selling it on the black market, and then I'm using that money for the most part to pay for things on the black market. So my money never ever touches the legitimate economy, which means that I don't set off any red flags. I haven't gone to the bank with a suitcase full of cash and set off AML, CTF frameworks or anything like that. I think there's two big barriers to why the use of cryptocurrencies has not happened writ large across the terrorist universe, jihadi or otherwise. And that's firstly is that it inserts a capability challenge, right? So you've got to work out what cryptocurrency is, how cryptocurrency works. You need devices, and it suffers from a liquidity problem in conjunction with that, right?
Right.
If I've got two choices as a terrorist in the back corners of Afghanistan between a suitcase full of US dollars and my phone that tells me that I've got X number of crypto dollars on it, I'll take the suitcase every time, right? Because I can take that.
And I've been making a point for a long time that, don't get me wrong, I love technology. I love apps and systems that deal in crypto, and I invest in cryptocurrency. But if you want anonymity, choosing a technical solution for that is, no matter what technical solution that is, it introduces vulnerabilities into
that's right.
into the equation. And there is nothing safer than keeping the thought in your head or sharing it with the person right in front of you, right? I mean, and the same thing goes with the flow of currency and the flow of drugs, goods, and other illicit things.
Yep. If I was the risk advisor to a terrorist organization, I'd be like, well, look, one of those leaves a trail and the other one doesn't.
Right.
So I hope I don't need to articulate to you what my advice would be. It's a no-brainer, really. There's some upsides to cryptocurrency, but I think the other challenge with it too is more about market stuff around fluctuation of value, right? My suitcase full of US dollars is always going to be worth $100,000, whereas, and it's going to buy me the same kind of cachet that I'm going to get from it. Whereas the value of my cryptocurrency skyrockets and collapses and skyrockets and collapses, and that's not really great.
Well, not only that, but if you're leveraging, if you're trying to do that, right, and if you're trying to actually set up networks where you're moving lots of cryptocurrency around, you're purchasing, guns and drugs or whatever with it, explosives, and you're doing this, and you've got lots of people involved and lots of handheld devices involved and lots of computers involved, somebody's going to screw up.
Yeah, that's right. And you also need suppliers who are prepared to accept their payment for a bunch of stolen AK-47s in cryptocurrency.
I'm sure that group exists somewhere.
Look, I reckon there's a bunch of bars in New York who will let you pay for your beer with your phone via cryptocurrency. But I'm pretty sure most of them would prefer dollar bills.
Right.
So, I think there's certainly risk around it, but certainly from the available evidence, there's been no broad, full spectrum take up of use of crypto for financing purposes.
And there's one other aspect of this, and that is that old-fashioned criminal network, and I'm envisioning it, drawn across a map of Europe through MENA. That is a network that facilitates the expansion of your movement and your ability to project power and violence.
Absolutely.
And you can't really replicate that with a network, on the internet.
No, you can't. It's not the same thing. And for the same reason that, given the freedom, most terrorist organizations would rather be running proper infrastructure and training camps where you put people through 12-month training programs like they were doing in Afghanistan before 2001, where you get people together and you have them face-to-face and you work them for 12 months solid, right? As opposed to, well, what I hope happens here, if it happens, is that a guy reads issue 2 of Inspire magazine or the version of Remire magazine that has pictures of trucks and manages to pick up what I'm trying to get them to do, right? In one of those scenarios, I can beat you until you understand. In the other one, I'm literally putting the information out there hoping that people pick it up, right? If they come into my network, I can work them on a more one-to-one basis, but I'm still doing that remotely. And I think, to be fair, part of this is age. I think I'm old enough where I think that handshakes and eye contact and all those sorts of things are important. I think as people get closer to 15, 14, 16, then that's less important because of the universe in which they've grown up. But, I just don't think it's powerful, especially if you're engaged in illicit activity. Trust is important. And, the old New Yorker cartoon on the internet, nobody knows that you're a dog.
Right.
There's no real way for me over my phone to verify that the person at the other end is actually who they say they are.
Well, and you could even sort of maybe draw parallels. You looked at ISIS when they were at their height of recruiting and they brought a lot of people in through these mechanisms. Those also weren't trusted.
No.
They weren't trusted entities, right? They looked at them as sheep and they used them as cannon fodder.
Absolutely. They weren't being given the keys to the city, that's for sure.
Yeah. So, it shows you they understand that dynamic very clearly.
Yeah. Look, don't get me wrong, all of those things around tech, they're exploitable opportunities for a terrorist organization. But I'm pretty sure that Baghdadi has not been, sitting on Twitter. Right? Because he's a highly valuable member of the organization to the extent that we assume he's still alive. He's not touching a phone, right? But for running the outer edges of your organization and engaging in those types of things, it works a treat. If we remember that terrorist organizations are relatively risk savvy, they've got pretty short leashes in terms of the line between their existence and their non-existence. There's not a lot of room there for miscalculation around the kinds of platforms that they engage in, the kinds of business ventures that they engage in, because they don't have much in the way of strategic depth. So they tend to be reasonably savvy about the kinds of decisions they make, especially in regards to things that can leave breadcrumbs through the forest. It's a risky enterprise.
It hits on a lot of things I've sort of been talking about, and I guess in this space, but also in more of the cyber arena as well, and sort of hitting at some of the hype there. We have a lot of capabilities, but very few people understand the risk and the vulnerabilities that are still inherent there. But I think your point about terrorist organizations is spot on. They understand in many cases risk better than the rest of us, and they're and they've certainly made their mistakes and they learned some of that the hard way. But picking up a phone on the battlefield and tweeting from the battlefield is a good way to punch out early.
Yeah, they've got some advantages in terms of how they respond to those sorts of things. For a government department to issue an edict that as of next week, well, they can't issue edicts about next week. Right? They're a government department. They have a bureaucratic process to go through, quite rightly, with public money, right? Is that we've got to make a decision about this. Okay, well, we're going to have to feed it up the chain, and the next committee doesn't meet for a month. Whereas someone like Islamic State or a non-state actor, full stop, can turn around and say, as of tomorrow, anybody who continues to tweet from the battlefield will be shot. And generally speaking, everyone will stop. And those who don't are going to either be shot by the non-state actor or they're going to wind up with a hellfire on their head.
Eli, it's been fun. I think there's more that we can touch on in this space. Of course, I'm going to ask you to come back and do that. But I think this is a good exercise, and I'm glad we were able to do it. It's sort of a bookend to the whole ISIS thing and the explosion of awareness of terrorists in the tech space. And now we see sort of how that ended up with ISIS, right? I mean, for all the hype of technology and everything else, look at where they ended up. I mean, they're, quickly devolving and from, a sort of almost quasi nation state into, back to what they should have always been and were destined to be, which is, a completely decentralized traditional terrorist organization.
Yeah, there'll be a cousin of Al Qaeda in its existing form, I checked earlier this week, and the sky is still where it belongs. It hasn't fallen in, despite the sensibility that we could have been forgiven for the last 3 years nearly, right, since the declaration of caliphate. Where
right.
Oh my God, this is the end of everything. We can't deal with this. We can't cope with this. And in actual fact, the thing that has been most effective in dealing with the Islamic State as a threat has been conventional kinetic military responses.
Yep.
Now, don't get me wrong. I'm reasonably confident that in 18 months, 2 years from now, when nothing has been done about the structural root drivers of disenfranchisement that led to their emergence or re-emergence in the first place, that we will be back doing a variation on the same thing. But in terms of, if you look at the difference between the capability of a terrorist organisation where it's got some territory under its control, whether we call it a safe haven like AQ had in Afghanistan up until 2001, or whether we call it the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, it makes them way more capable. They get to train people, they get to organise themselves better, they get to generate income, and that means that their power projection increases dramatically. So, as an exercise in killing off that capability and that capacity, it's been highly effective. Doesn't do much about the guys who want to go and find copies of Inspire or the big magazine on the internet and go out and kill people.
That's a fringe element that, quite frankly, we will never be able to shut that down. And there will always be a cause or 10 causes that they can choose from. If you are that kind of an individual, you will find a way to cause trouble. And
absolutely. We talked about Nazis before.
Yeah. Take your pick.
And if people still think that that's an ideological framework that's worth subscribing to.
Yeah, and that sort of tells you everything you need to know about human nature, I guess.
It does. So, there's no way you'll stop people deciding that they want to find a reason to justify or find a justification for going out and doing what they want to do. If that's the way that they've decided to play things out, then that's what's going to happen. The upside is that if you don't have a terrorist organisation producing fresh, updated, responsive and dynamic content on a daily basis, then the salience and resonance of that content diminishes over time.
Correct.
So it's an important part of addressing these types of things. I think is where you can taking concrete action to diminish the capability of the terrorist organisation makes perfect sense.
I agree 100%. Understand the risk and address it, but also keep it. I think what people like us try to do is also, encourage folks to keep it in perspective, right?
I think that's if there's one thing that the world would benefit from, would be that if everybody, when they talk about terrorism, remembered that it's, aside from a handful of often contested cases, terrorism is not an existential threat.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even if they're exploiting whatever the next amazing and slightly horrible and probably overall detrimental to society communications technology platform is, regardless of what that is, they'll exploit it, whoever they are, whether they're jihadis or, I don't know, some kind of down-the-road neo-Luddites or whatever, right? They'll exploit it because that's what terrorist organizations do, especially if it's emerging technology. It's exploitable. But that doesn't mean that civilization's about to collapse.
No, there are technologies that they might eventually exploit to achieve that, but it will have nothing to do with social media.
That's almost certainly true.
All right. Thanks, Levi.
No worries, man.
Hey guys, I just want to take a minute to thank you for the reviews on iTunes. Thank you for the emails. Please keep them coming. If you want to know more about Covert Contact, how you can contact me, how you can support the show, how you can advertise on the podcast, go to blogsofwar.com. Everything you need to know is right there. Thanks.
You have been listening to Covert Contact from Blogs of War. This podcast is produced, written, and hosted by John Little. Follow John on Twitter at Blogs of War and join the conversation with hashtag #CCBOW. Thanks for listening.